The birthday of someone is always something fascinating to see, especially when it brings the smile of a young child. But sometimes such a smile brings a price. Today a young girl named Susie was very happy due that she was going to make her 6th birthday, and her father promised that he would bring her a plushie. Would he keep his promise? Her hope said her father would. As she heard the door opening, she jumped down and ran to the door, giving a huge hug to her father. But she got sad when she noticed that he was empty-handed. With a smile, he kissed her cheek and whispered in her ear, "I just came to pick you up so we could get your birthday present." She squealed with joy and went to tell her mother. Once hearing that her mother accepted letting her go with her father to buy her birthday present, she ran outside to the car and entered. They both drove away and went to town to find her birthday present. After several hours, they were still searching. Susie was upset because there was none that she liked. Her father, Chris, was starting to lose hope and temper with his daughter's difficulty on finding something to make herself happy, until they stopped at the last place that could probably have anything. An old antique store they used to visit. It seemed closed. Susie ran towards the store and looked inside. Chris, sighing, followed and said sorry to the owner of the shop as Susie was looking for the shelf where toys were. She was able to find it and look through the small cars, dolls, and masks around, but no plushies. Until she found something. It seemed like a plushie, but it was strange. It had large, round red eyes, 2 long antennae, a pincer-like mouth, 2 tiny hands, and large feet. The body was round and completely covered in purple fur. She squealed, happily recognizing it to be a Pokemon, and grabbed it off the shelf and took it to her father. She kept yelling, "Buy me this Venonat, Daddy! Buy me this Venonat!" over and over until her father gave in. The shop owner felt a shudder as he saw the purple fur ball and asked if they didn't prefer anything else. But Susie shakes her head, demanding the Venonat. Chris pays, and they went to the car. It was already nighttime when they were halfway to arrive home. As they arrived home, Chris smiled, watching his daughter hugging the plushie against her chest. But one thing was strange. He could have sworn that thing was staring at him with those big, round, red eyes. Could it be the reflection of the weak streetlights, or was it his imagination? Hard to tell. They went inside, and Susie ran to her mommy and showed the Pokemon. As it was revealed to the light, the fur seemed slightly wet and the pincer mouth was sharp. But the strangest thing was the round red eyes seemed to be scaly. A shiver came over Susie's mother's spine. She smiled slightly and grabbed the plushie softly, putting it on the couch. She asked her daughter to go clean her hands and come to dinner. Late that night, as Susie was sleeping, hugging her Venonat, she heard something. She came out of her bed and followed the sound. She walked into the living room and found her laying on the couch, moaning and whimpering in pain. When she got closer, a scream escaped her lips. After a few hours, Susie's mother was admitted to the hospital. She was found by her daughter with blood running through her eyes and mouth, and with boils in most part of the body. She seemed to be suffering from horrible headaches, internal pain, and seizures. Also, her skin had these strange, thick boils. No one knows what she was suffering from, but seemed to be something dangerous. Susie was very sad, but she had to go back to sleep. She put her new toy on her desk as she walked to bed. She stared in the dark, looking at the creature with the purple fur, as it started it back to her with the dead eyes it had. The next morning, she went to school, taking her Venonat plushie with her. She smiled happily, staying with her, yet she was tormented by in what state her mother was in. She found her on the couch. As she went to school, she showed off her new plushie to her friends, even to her favorite teacher, but something strange started to happen. After a few minutes, when she was playing with her friends at lunch break, Her friend started to feel a strong headache. 2 janitors came and picked them up, moving the Venonat away from the children, giving them back to Susie. The poor girl sat down upset, and looking at her doll, being bored, she started to play with it and grabbed both of its hands. Suddenly a strange sound came out of the doll. It seemed to have said Venonat in an unnatural voice. But Susie didn't get frightened. She hugged the doll tightly, happy to find a new feature. Although her happiness was cut short as an ambulance came, she went to a teacher and asked what was happening. 2 janitors, 7 children, and a teacher were somehow horribly sick. This made Susie remember her mother. In that day, when Chris came to pick up Susie, the young child asked if she could go see her mother at the hospital. Chris didn't like this much, but he didn't have any other option. He knew his daughter was suffering. So did the favor. Once he stopped the car, Susie ran towards the hospital, remembering the room where her mother was. She knocked on the door. A nurse saw her and said her mother was resting since the last time they visited. They believed probably she needed rest. However, the nurse allowed the small child to open the door and go talk with her mother. Susie opened the door silently and placed the Venonat on the table. She turned on the lights, and a scream of horror escaped the poor child's lips, alerting the whole building. What she saw, no one was ready to see. The once beautiful mother that Susie was now deceased. But death wasn't the reason why Susie screamed. The way her mother was left to die is what made her scream. Her mother had her hair purple, and the skin partially purple. Her eyes were swallow and red, nearly coming out of her skull. Large boils and thick purple hair covered the skin, and the hands were withered, looking just like skin and bones, and the feet seemed to have become larger. Susie moved closer and touched her mother's face, whimpering, but jumped back as soon as one of the fragile boils popped, releasing purple goo. The boils were so fragile that a simple touch would make them disintegrate. Chris ran to her daughter and wrapped his arms around her. Then he saw what was traumatizing her even more. His wife was killed by something. Chris yelled for a medic to come. Some nurses and doctors ran in, but they could barely hold themselves when they saw the abomination that was in their way. When leaving, he noticed the Venonat and was about to grab it when he noticed something. There was a note next to the Venonat saying, "She played with me." What did that to me? Who put that there? Who wrote that? But the strangest thing wasn't that. There was purplish goo on the paper, and there were handprints, similar to the Venonat's hands. What's going on here? Chris grabbed a towel and then wrapped it around the plushie, taking it back to his daughter. He didn't believe in coincidence and on superstition, but something wrong was going on. Once he gave the doll back to Susie, he took away the towel. He noticed that it was soaked in strange purple goo. What was this thing? What was it doing on the doll's body? Question kept crawling all around Chris. He told his daughter to come with him to the hospital. Susie didn't want to go, but Chris kept insisting. So she did what her father said. When going to the doctor that was following his wife's treatment, he asked what happened to her. The doctor said that they had 10 other cases from a school that ended in the same tragedy in less than 24 hours. The effect on the eyes were vaguely similar to the effects of a disease called harlequin ictosis. And the enlarged feet were similar to the disease named elephantitis, but the rest was just plain strange. They tried to link them to the 2 previous mentioned diseases, but they didn't have a thing to do with them. A test result didn't match in the slightest. Chris asked the doctors to run tests on Susie's doll just in case it had asked them to use gloves. The doctor thought it was a strange request and did as Chris told. While Chris and Susie waited in a room of any news of test results, a policeman walked to them and asked them a few questions since Chris was married to one of the victims. There was one thing in common with all these cases. Susie was present in all the crime scenes. The little child started whimpering. Chris wrapped his arms around Susie and tried to calm her down. Then he looked at her and asked her if she knew anything or if it was just pure coincidence. She looked at the Venonat Plushie, then at her father and said, "Venonat gave me a note. He said he wanted to play with Mommy and my friends, and the teacher. He then said he played with the janitors too." The policeman thought it was strange, but suddenly they heard something. Venonat. The word echoed once in an unnatural way, then it was repeated twice. Chris looked at the plushie and moved closer. The fur was wet and dripping with the purple goo. There was a note next to it. He read it out loud. "Play with me. Be one of me." Chris stared at the thing. That was not Plushie. What work of the devil was that? The policeman was starting to get angry with all the nonsense and grabbed the doll. But suddenly he yelled in pain and slammed the doll on the ground. There were 2 holes on his hand, like it was if the policeman was bitten. Chris held his daughter close. The policeman started yelling and demanding answers, but suddenly he fell on his knees, holding his head, and looked at his hands as large boils were growing. Chris could see something amazingly horrible. The policeman seemed that was infected and started to die and changing much faster than the others. The boils with the thick hair were starting to appear. Blood was running through his eyes, mouth and nose. The hair and skin were becoming purplish. The hands were cracking loudly and withering as the feet were growing, and the eyes were becoming swallow and red. Chris covered the sight of his daughter away from that awful show. Then he noticed the doll. It was not laying down. It was standing with its eyes staring at them. Chris decided to take care of it. He threw a sheet at the thing to see what would happen. The sheet was becoming soaked fast, but besides that the doll didn't seem to move. Quickly, Chris wrapped the sheet around the Venonat plushie and grabbed on it. He called for Susie, and they ran outside to the car. That doll was too dangerous. They had to get rid of it. Even Susie knew that thing had to go, no matter what. He stopped near a gas station and filled the car with gasoline, as well as a bottle with gasoline. Then he drove away until he found an isolated place, an old house nearly crumbling. He grabbed on the demonic doll and a bottle of gasoline, and walked to the small house. He placed the thing in the house and dumped the gasoline on it. Then he started to make a trail that led to the door. Smirking, Chris took out a box of fire matches, but suddenly the cursed Venonat Chris looked, and in shock he jumped back. He saw the plushie in the same space, where the words scrambled on the wall behind it. "Play with me. Come play with me. Susie is nice to me. Susie would take me everywhere. Susie's my friend. Everyone tried to take me away from Susie. They dropped when they touched. It's your turn to drop. Play with me." Chris was entering in panic as he looked through the words. Then he looked down at the plushie and growled loudly as he took out a gun and shot the doll 3 times. After that, he lit up a match and dropped it on the gasoline so the doll could burn. No more deaths, no more disfiguration, no more suspicion, no more poisoning, no more playing around. The doll was destroyed. They were free. Chris drove home before taking a look at the burning house in the back. He was in relief now, or so he believed. When Chris arrived home, he straightway put his dear daughter to sleep. Susie was quite tired after all that madness. He noticed he was tired himself, so he went to bed. But nightmares flooded his mind. He saw himself in a shelf, alone. He was small, and seemed that he had shrunk quite a lot. He then noticed something that made things a bit more clear. He saw himself and his daughter entering through a door, so obviously that he was seeing things through someone or something else's eyes. He saw Susie going up to him and happily picking him up. The things he saw were all very familiar, but he didn't know how they were familiar. From whose eyes was he seeing these things? But then he started to come to his senses. The different ways he was being taken. The deceased wife picking him up and putting him on the couch, watching everyone's dinner. He was seeing things through the doll's eyes. He could see being taken to Susie's school and being played like that doll. It was supposed to be through the doll's eyes. He could see being taken to He all ended with seeing being shot several times and being burned alive. After all that, Chris woke up sweating. It was just a nightmare. Just a nightmare, right? The doll's been shot and burned. Quickly, Chris checked his whole body. No boils. He was safe. But why did he have that nightmare? The result of the trauma that he had suffered in these days. Questions circled through his head, but he sighed and headed to the kitchen to get himself a glass of water. He was just nervous, that's all. He walked to his daughter's bedroom and smiled seeing her asleep, but suddenly he heard something familiar, something that haunted him. Venonat. He jumped up, looking around. That name, that strange unnatural voice. It was close, but where? His daughter heard it too. She had woke up, scared and whimpering. Chris held her close and looked around. He heard something coming from the kitchen. He carefully walked towards the hall and grabbed a flashlight just in case. He walked towards the kitchen and moved the door open. When he looked inside, there was a plushie with burned purple fur, with 3 bullet wounds, one being in its big, round, red eyes, and the other 2 through its body. Tiny hands, 2 long antennae, 2 large feet, and a black liquid dripping from its wounds and fur. And across the walls was written, "Play with me. Susie doesn't like me anymore. Be with me. Susie let her daddy hurt me. Be one of me. Susie is mean. Play with me. Susie will join everyone else. Play with me until you drop dead like everyone."